My parents mocked my career and refused to help me buy a home, so I bought the company that fired my dad. The look on his face when I walked into the boardroom was priceless. Then I 31M, never thought I'd be writing this. But here I am, sitting in a corner office on the 34th floor of a building my parents once told me I'd never be good enough to enter. My hands are still shaking. Not from nerves, from satisfaction. Let me take you back. I was the family disappointment. Not because I was a bad kid, not because I failed school, but because I didn't follow the plan. My father was a mid-level executive at a manufacturing company, not the CEO, not even close, but the way he carried himself, you'd think he ran the entire operation. My mother enabled every bit of it. Together, they had this very specific vision for their children. My older brother was the golden child. Law school, corporate firm, corner office by 30. He checked every box. Me, I wanted to build things, not physical things, digital ones. I was obsessed with software, with code, with the idea that you could create something out of nothing using just a laptop and your brain. My parents hated it. Every family dinner was the same. My father would go on about how my brother was making real moves, building a real career, while I was wasting my 20s playing with computers. My mother would nod along, occasionally adding that maybe I should consider something more stable, like accounting or finance. I'd sit there chewing my food, swallowing my pride along with it. When I was 23, I landed my first real job at a tech startup. The pay wasn't amazing, but the potential was massive. I was employee number 11. I told my parents about it over the phone, genuinely excited, and my father's response was a long pause, followed by him asking how much it paid. When I told him, he laughed. Not a chuckle, a full laugh. He told my mother the number and I could hear her sighing in the background. He told me to call back when I had a real job. That conversation burned a hole in me that took years to heal. I replayed it on loop for weeks. The tone, the pause before the laugh, the way my mother's sigh tarried through the phone, like she was already grieving the son she wished I was. I started working harder, not to prove them wrong, not yet, but because work was the only place where people judged me by what I produced instead of what I represented. I stopped calling home as much. Sundays became every other Sunday, then monthly, then whenever I remembered or felt guilty enough. My mother noticed, of course. She texted me little passive things about how they never heard from me anymore, how my brother always made time for family. I'd read them, put my phone down and go back to my screen. Fast forward 2 years. The startup was growing. I'd moved from junior developer to lead engineer. We got Series A funding, then Series B. My equity was starting to look like real money on paper, but paper money doesn't buy houses. And that's where the next humiliation came. I was 25, and the housing market in my city was brutal. I'd saved a decent down payment, but I was short by about $40,000. I knew my parents had money. My father's salary, my mother's inheritance from my grandmother, they weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. My brother had gotten help from them when he bought his first condo. $70,000, interest-free, no questions asked. So I figured I'd ask. I drove 2 hours to their house on a Sunday, sat down at the kitchen table, laid it all out. The property I'd found, the numbers, my savings, the gap I needed to fill. My father leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He told me that my brother's situation was different, that he had a stable career with a clear trajectory, and that investing in him was a safe bet. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and told me that giving me money for a house when I could lose my job at any moment would be irresponsible. My mother agreed. She said maybe I should rent for a few more years, get my feet on the ground, figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. I was 25 years old. I had a job, I had savings, I had a plan. And they still couldn't see me. I drove home that night in silence, no music, no phone calls. Just me and the highway, and a promise I made to myself. I would never ask them for anything again. The next morning I got up, went to work, and started building like my life depended on it. Because in some ways it did. Not financially, I was fine. But something inside me needed to prove that their measurement of me was wrong. That the scale they used was broken, not me. I stopped going to family dinners altogether. Holidays became quick visits. Show up, eat, leave before the comparison started. My mother told me I was being distant. My father didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care enough to mention it. So I didn't. The startup kept growing. By 27, we'd been acquired by a larger tech firm. My equity turned into real money. Not life-changing wealth overnight, but enough to buy the house on my own, put a solid amount into investments, and start building something else on the side. I began quietly investing in small businesses, learning about acquisitions, about leverage, about how companies actually worked behind the curtain. I read everything I could get my hands on. I found mentors, people who had built and sold companies, people who understood the game at a level my father never did, despite all his posturing. I'd co-founded a small private equity group with two partners I'd met through the startup world. We started acquiring underperforming mid-sized companies, restructuring them, and either flipping them or holding them for cash flow. We weren't massive, not yet, but we were smart, we were hungry, and we were growing fast. And here's where fate decided to hand me the most poetic opportunity of my life. My father's company, the one he'd worked at for over 20 years, the one he wore like a badge of honor at every family gathering, was struggling. I'd been tracking it casually, the way you keep an eye on a storm in the distance. Revenue was down. Leadership was a mess. They'd lost 2 major contracts in 18 months, and the board was getting desperate. Word in the industry was that they were quietly looking for a buyer or a significant investor to come in and restructure. I brought it to my partners. The company was undervalued, had solid infrastructure and a decent workforce, but was being run into the ground by leadership that hadn't adapted in over a decade. My partners saw the same thing I did: opportunity. We spent 3 months doing due diligence, building our offer, lining up financing. And then we made our move. The acquisition closed 2 weeks before my 31st birthday. I remember signing the final documents in a conference room that smelled like new carpet and old ambition. My partners and I shook hands. One of them made a joke about how I seemed oddly calm for someone who'd just closed a multi-million-dollar deal. I smiled and told him I had a lot of practice keeping my emotions in check. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone in my family. My name wasn't on the press release, my firm's name was. And since my parents had never once taken an interest in what I actually did for a living, there was zero chance they'd connect the dots. To them, I was still the kid playing with computers. My brother might have stumbled across it. It was in corporate law after all. But my firm's name wouldn't have meant anything to him. We operated quietly, by design. Here's where I need to give some context about my father's position. He wasn't a nobody at this company, but he wasn't irreplaceable either. He was a department head, mid-level management, and from what I'd gathered through the due diligence process, his department was one of the least efficient in the entire organization. Bloated team, outdated processes, poor output metrics. On paper, his division was a textbook case for restructuring. I didn't go in looking for revenge. I want to be clear about that. When we acquired the company, the plan was always to do what we do: assess, restructure, optimize. But when I saw his department's numbers, when I saw the waste and the stagnation and the leadership failures that mirrored everything I'd observed about my father my entire life, I realized that this wasn't just business. This was a mirror. The board meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning, first official meeting, with the new ownership group present. My partners and I had agreed that I'd take point on this one since I'd led the analysis. I put on my best suit, walked into that building for the first time, and took the elevator to the executive floor. The boardroom was glass-walled. Long table. 12 chairs. The existing leadership team was already seated when I walked in. I saw him immediately, my father, sitting 3 seats from the end, looking mildly annoyed the way he always did when he was forced into meetings he thought were beneath him. He was reviewing something on his phone. He didn't look up. I walked to the head of the table, set my briefcase down, and waited. When he finally looked up, the color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might pass out. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. He looked at me like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense. I watched something shift behind his eyes: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something I'd never seen from him before: fear. I introduced myself to the room, told them who I was, what our firm did, what our vision was for the company going forward. I was calm, professional, every word measured. I didn't look at my father more than I looked at anyone else. I treated him like any other employee in that room, which honestly was exactly what he was. After the general presentation, I moved into the restructuring overview, department by department. When I got to his division, I laid out the numbers without emotion. Efficiency was down 32% compared to industry benchmarks. Overhead was bloated. Key performance targets had been missed for 7 consecutive quarters. I explained that this division would undergo significant changes: staffing review, process overhaul, new leadership evaluation. He sat there frozen, didn't say a word. Everyone else in the room was taking notes, nodding, asking questions. He just stared at the table. After the meeting, he caught me in the hallway. He grabbed my arm, actually grabbed it, and pulled me aside. His voice was low, almost shaking. He asked me what I was doing, what this was, how this was possible. I told him calmly that I'd been building something for years, that this was my firm's acquisition, and that I was there to do a job. He asked if this was some kind of revenge. I told him no. I told him it was business. Then I told him something I'd been carrying for years. I told him that every time he laughed at my career, every time he compared me to my brother, every time he dismissed what I was building, he was talking to someone he didn't understand. And that his refusal to understand me didn't make me less capable. It just made him less informed. He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since the boardroom meeting, and things have gotten complicated. My father didn't get fired. I want to be clear about that, because I've seen people in similar situations use their position to settle personal scores, and that's not what I'm about. His department went through the same review process as every other division. An independent assessment team, not me, not my partners, evaluated performance, structure, and personnel. The recommendation was to restructure the department, not eliminate it. 2 positions in his team were deemed redundant, and the assessment flagged leadership concerns. The recommendation was to move my father into a reduced role, a lateral shift essentially, while a new department head with a more modern approach was brought in. He took it badly. Of course he did. He called my mother, who called me within the hour, absolutely beside herself. She told me I was destroying my father, that I was using my position to humiliate him, that this was cruel and unnecessary. I told her that the restructuring was company-wide, that it was based on data, and that I had removed myself from any decisions involving his department specifically, to avoid a conflict of interest. She didn't believe me. She told me I'd changed, that money had made me cold, and that she didn't recognize me anymore. The irony of hearing that from the woman who couldn't recognize my potential when I was sitting right in front of her was not lost on me. My brother called the next day. His tone was different. Not angry exactly, but cautious, calculated. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. We sat across from each other at a quiet place near my office, and he told me that our parents were devastated, that our father felt humiliated, and that the family was falling apart. Then, he asked me very carefully if there was anything I could do to make this easier. I asked him if he ever once called me when I was the one struggling. He went quiet. I told him I didn't make the assessment, I didn't make the recommendation, and I wasn't going to override a professional evaluation to protect someone's ego. He nodded slowly and left. The house was in chaos for 2 weeks. My mother refused to speak to me. My father, according to my brother, had barely left the house. He'd accepted the reduced role, but the shame was eating him alive. The man who had spent decades defining himself by his title had just been told by the market, by objective, impersonal data, that he wasn't as valuable as he thought he was. I understood that pain. I'd felt it every time I sat at that kitchen table. A month and a half in, something unexpected happened. My father showed up at my office. No call, no warning. He walked into the lobby and told the receptionist he was there to see me. When I got the notification, I almost didn't go down, but I did. He looked tired, older than I remembered, even though I'd seen him just weeks ago. He was wearing a plain jacket, no tie. Strange for a man who treated his work attire like armor. We sat in a small conference room, just the 2 of us, and he did something I'd never seen him do in 31 years. He apologized. Not perfectly. Not in a clean, scripted way. He stumbled over it. He told me he'd been thinking that the past few weeks had forced him to look at a lot of things he'd been avoiding. He said he knew he'd been hard on me, that he'd measured me against standards that didn't apply, and that he'd been wrong. He told me he didn't understand my world, and instead of trying to, he dismissed it. He said he was sorry. Then he told me something that cracked the wall I'd spent years building. He said that when he saw me walk into that boardroom, his first feeling wasn't anger or fear. It was pride. He told me it hit him later, after the shock wore off, that his son had walked into a room full of executives and commanded it, and he'd spent years telling that same son he'd amount to nothing. I sat there for a long time, not saying anything. I wasn't going to cry. I'd made that decision before I walked in, but something shifted in my chest. Something heavy that had been sitting there for years moved slightly, not gone, but loosened. I told him I appreciated him coming. I told him I didn't do any of this to hurt him. I told him the truth, that when the acquisition opportunity came up, I saw it as a business decision first, and that I'd gone out of my way to keep personal feelings out of professional evaluations. But I also told him something I needed him to hear. I told him that the years of dismissal had cost us both. It cost me a relationship with my parents during the most formative years of my career, and it cost him the chance to watch his son build something remarkable. Those years were gone, and we couldn't get them back. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Before he left, he asked me one thing. He asked if I'd come to dinner on Sunday. Not a family event, not a performance, just dinner. He said my mother had been cooking all week, her way of processing things, and the fridge was overflowing. I told him I'd think about it. Update 3. I went to dinner. I almost didn't. I sat in my car outside their house for 15 minutes, engine off, staring at the front door like it was the entrance to somewhere I already escaped from. But I went in. It was awkward at first. My mother hugged me too long and too tight, and when she pulled back her eyes were red but she was smiling. She didn't bring up the company, the restructuring, or any of it. She just told me to sit down because the food was getting cold. My brother was there too, which surprised me. He brought a bottle of wine, an expensive one, which was his version of a peace offering. We sat around the same kitchen table where I'd been laughed at, dismissed, and denied help, and for the first time in years, nobody was performing, nobody was comparing, nobody was measuring. My father was quiet for most of the meal. He asked me a few questions about my work. Real questions, not loaded ones. He asked how the acquisition process worked, how we identified target companies, what the restructuring process actually looked like, beyond the boardroom. I explained it simply, and he listened. Actually listened. He shook his head slowly, and said something about how he'd spent 30 years in business, and never understood the side of it I was describing. It wasn't self-pity, it was genuine surprise. After dinner, while my mother and brother were in the kitchen arguing about whether the dessert needed more time in the oven, my father and I sat on the back porch. The same porch where he used to lecture me about making responsible choices. The same porch where I'd sit as a teenager, headphones in, coding on a second-hand laptop, while he grilled steaks and talked to my brother about law school applications like I wasn't even there. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't rehash old wounds. He asked me what was next, for the company, for my firm, for me. And I told him. I told him about the 5-year plan, about the other acquisitions we were exploring, about the vision I had for building something that would outlast me. He listened to all of it. Really listened. Leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the way he used to when my brother talked about his cases. And when I finished, he told me he was proud of me. Not as an afterthought. He said the words deliberately, like he'd been rehearsing them, and wanted to make sure he got them right.